Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and another installment of recorded lessons for this week. So this week's lesson, or at least part of it, has to do with critical reading and critical listening, and the ability of us to pull out what I call argumentative tricks, or rhetorical tricks, techniques that are used by commentators and writers when talking about um, news information. In today's day and age, it's probably never ever been more important that we're able to consume the news, if you will, that we hear and we read critically. And the reason I say it's more important than ever is because today, so much of the news that you receive are coming from these 24-hour cable news slash entertainment channels. And these channels all purposely market themselves to a particular political demographic. And so as a result of that, you get very little objective news on these types of stations, but instead you get a lot of sort of politically biased commentary. And if you're not prepared to listen to this stuff critically, oftentimes they can trick you into agreeing with their argument when in fact they haven't presented a sound argument. So the purpose of this week's lesson is to help us to identify some of the most common fallacies or argumentative tricks that are used by commentators and writers to try to sway a listener or a reader to their side of an argument without actually presenting a strong argument. So when we're talking about the news, critical current events, or history, or these types of things, when we try to convince people of our opinion, we should be basing it on a sound and logical argument, meaning that your evidence, your premises, lead logically to the conclusion. But what you find often when you read opinion articles or when you listen to commentary on television talk shows is you find that there's a lot of tricks that are used by commentators and writers to get you to agree with them, when in fact they haven't made a logical or sound argument. So the goal of this project and the goal of this lesson is to get us acquainted with some of these tricks so that when we read, when we listen, we can watch out for these things. And when we see these types of things being used by a commentator or a writer, we can know to be wary that there may be other flaws in the argument and to be wary about the conclusions that they're trying to convince us to accept. One of the most common in the United States that you will encounter is the so-called sacred cow. And I know there's a lot of information on here, and you'll be able to go back and look at these more closely if you pause the video. But I'm going to just kind of roll through these relatively quickly. But the sacred cow is one of the most common, especially in the United States. And a sacred cow is any time an author uses the argument that some kind of legislation or action fundamentally counters sort of highly held ideals of American patriotism and nationalism. So an excellent hypothetical example of this, and the reason, of course, that an individual will do this is because an individual is trying to convince you to agree with them by appealing to your pride as an American. It's an appeal to your nationalism. So if someone were to say, hypothetically, that the healthcare policy of Barack Obama is opposed to the basic principles of the United States, and it will destroy the American way of life. This is an example of an author that wants the reader to believe that the Affordable Health Care Act is un-American. And so rather than making an argument about the Affordable Health Care Act that is logical, the author is instead trying to get you to agree with him simply on the premise that he asserts that it somehow runs counter to what America stands for ideologically, which of course is a tremendously huge stretch and not a sound argument. Anytime you hear somebody criticize somebody by comparing them to a founding figure, well, this person's nothing like George Washington, and George Washington would have totally disagreed with their ideas. Anytime you do that, you have a couple of things going on. You often have a historical fallacy. You also usually have a sacred cow. One of the most common in foreign relations that you will find is the appeal to fear. An appeal to fear is very simple, and this is one of the easiest ones for us to detect. An appeal to fear is an idea that if you do not agree with what the author says, that there will be some kind of dire consequences. Oftentimes, an appeal to fear is presenting a false dichotomy. So a dichotomy means duality, like two sides. Oftentimes, an appeal to fear is presenting a false dichotomy, meaning that usually when somebody uses an appeal to fear, what they're posing you is that there's only two extremes. You either disagree with me and it's the end of the world, or you agree with me and everything's saved. It's a false dichotomy because there's really more options and more possibilities than what the author is presenting, but the author is using fear to present it as though there's only two options. A great example of an appeal to fear that you hear all the time right now relates to the Iran nuclear negotiations. The Iran nuclear negotiations, the opposition, particularly opposition that's kind of been played up by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is the idea that the result of the nuclear deal with Iran is a nuclear arms race and largely, possibly, ultimately a nuclear war. That's an appeal to fear. It's also a false dichotomy, and it misrepresents the actual nature of the situation, and it misrepresents what we really know about the reality of the situation in terms of danger and threat. A red herring is another one that's very common, and these are sometimes a little bit more difficult to locate than is the appeal to fear. But nonetheless, the definition of what a red herring is pretty simple. A red herring is any time the author tries to basically convince you by changing the subject. So the term red herring actually comes from, it's a term that relates to hunting in England, as I understand it, and the usage of a fish, a herring, across a trail to misdirect the dogs. So the red herring, okay, trying to mislead you off of the subject and gain your support through that misleading action. So obviously, another hypothetical example I have listed here related to healthcare. The people that support national healthcare claim that the Constitution is a living document that allows for change. But these same individuals argue that the Second Amendment is unchanging and relates only to militias and muzzle-loading rifles. So what the author has done there is the author has, rather than making an argument about the Affordable Care Act and the Constitution and implied clauses, the author has instead turned around and started talking about the Second Amendment. And the actual discussion is not actually about the Second Amendment. And so the author has diverted the conversation, and by diverting the conversation and using that comparison, the author is actually using a red herring, trying to get you to agree with them by making a counterpoint that is actually unrelated to the main point of the argument. So another one that's very common, a little bit more challenging to pick out, is the straw man. And the straw man is very simple. And I know you see, oh my goodness, there's so many words up here on the screen. Again, and just, if you have to go back and look at these more closely, just go back and look at them and pause the recording. But a straw man is an example, and very simple to remember what this is. A straw man is any time that an individual, in refuting another person's argument, does so by effectively misrepresenting the argument. So the hypothetical example, so this is putting words into somebody's mouth, basically. So the hypothetical example is that if person A said, I argue that the United States should legalize marijuana, okay? Obviously, that's an argument being made in a lot of places in the United States, and 4 states have done that. So somebody makes that argument, they say, I think that recreational marijuana should be legalized. Okay, that's a political issue. Okay, well, let's say person B responds and said, no, the United States should not do this because narcotics are highly addictive, and widespread availability of them will result in widespread addiction to cocaine and other hard drugs. Now, that's a perfect example of a straw man because they're refuting the individual by misrepresenting their opinion or their position. The position of the other person was not that cocaine should be legalized. The position of the other person was that marijuana should be legalized. But in refuting it or attempting to refute it, they've used a trick by refuting something that was not the position of the original speaker. So it's a misrepresentation of the other person's position. And it's used again to sway somebody to your argument when you do not have or you're not posing a logical and sound argument. So what the person has done is refuted an easier point to refute, but a point that was that is a misrepresentation of the person's original point. It's putting words into somebody's mouth. Another one of the easiest to identify is name calling. Anytime that someone is attacking an individual by calling them names. Anytime someone, so for example, we've heard a lot this campaign year in 2015, we've heard a lot of people like Donald Trump calling people slob and these types of things. And that doesn't mean, you have to dislike Donald Trump or that you have to like Donald Trump. But it does simply mean that behavior is what we would call name calling. And anytime you're name calling someone, you're using that to gain people's support, gain people's kind of sympathies for your position by effectively deriding another person with childish and low blow kinds of name calling. Calling someone a crook or a slob or a Marxist or a dictator when they're clearly not. That's name calling, and that's basically slandering the position of the other person and trying to use that as a way to gain sympathy from your audience. Historical fallacy. We see this a lot too. Historical fallacy is another one, particularly when you talk about things like international relations. Historical fallacies you encounter quite a lot. You will find a person using history as a way to justify their position now quite often. Fallacy means it's false, right? A fallacy means, hey, this is false. So a historical fallacy is when somebody uses a false historical comparison to make their point. So if somebody says, these policies that are like certain policies taken by the United States government today, these policies are similar to when the Nazis rose to power. That's a historical fallacy, almost positively. I mean, I've given you a non-specific example, but that's almost always a historical fallacy. The likelihood of there being a true and legitimate comparison to the Nazis and, say, the Obama administration is completely ridiculous, and it misrepresents history by making a false comparison. But the false comparison, and sometimes this is also an appeal to fear, the false comparison scares the audience and encourages them to disagree with something because the thing that they've been asked to disagree with is being associated with something that's absolutely of the most terrible consequence. There's a lot of like conspiracy theories about September 11th. And there's that famous documentary film, the Zeitgeist film, that was all about a conspiracy behind 9/11, or at least that was part of it. And that whole section of the movie about history was in itself a large historical fallacy, at least on many levels, because it was misrepresenting the actual events of the historical past and saying that they were basically the same as what the authors believed happened during 9/11. So, and that's just an example, something maybe you guys have heard of that stuff, but be wary of conspiracy theories, guys. Usually a conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theory because there's not enough evidence to support the theory. Just saying, so you should always be wary of that. But historical fallacy is using a false historical comparison. Making a comparison between something in the past where there's not really a legitimate comparison. Like I've heard people make a comparison between Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler at the lead up to World War II. And historically, and this is something I know quite a lot about as a historian, historically they're just not good comparisons in any way, shape, or form. They're completely dissimilar. But if an author uses that comparison, they're much more likely to gain your sympathies for them when it comes to their position on Ukraine, Putin, and so forth. So, some other common tricks that you encounter are things like begging the question. Begging the question is basically circular reasoning. It's posing the conclusion as one of the premises of the argument. So an example could be like Vladimir Putin is a dictator. Vladimir Putin's a bad dictator. There's a war in Ukraine. Therefore, because Vladimir Putin's a bad dictator, he must be responsible. That's a circular argument because the idea that Vladimir Putin is a bad dictator hasn't been proven, but it's in fact the conclusion and also the premise. And that may, in fact, it could be true. But the person hasn't proved it. Instead, they've used it as a basic point that's unproven that serves as their conclusion and as a leading premise. So begging the question is circular argumentation. Anytime you're using your conclusion as one of your primary premises. Another really common one that you'll find a lot is confident speculation, or speculation of any kind. I mentioned the conspiracy theory film a little while ago, and conspiracy theories are very common. But the reason you should be wary of conspiracy theories is because conspiracy theories are perfect examples of confident speculation. A conspiracy theorist uses circumstantial evidence and speculation, but often presents it as though it's fact. And as I was mentioning, I mentioned the kind of conspiracy theory documentary, the Zeitgeist movie. That movie is, when it comes to the history, for example, of the 20th century in the United States, it's all speculation. There's no actual smoking gun evidence for any of the things that it's suggesting. It is entirely speculative. And speculation is never, ever good enough for a sound argument. As you become trained in making arguments, you have to realize that sound arguments must have convincing evidence. And in order for a point to be proven, the evidence must logically lead to it. And if it does not, then it's a speculation. And it doesn't mean that speculation is worthless and we shouldn't ever speculate. I mean, of course we should speculate. But it does not necessarily follow that we can pose speculation as though it is in fact true, or as though we in fact have the evidence to assert its truth or falsity. All right, guys, I really hope this is helpful. Obviously, there's more. There's more of the stuff that you could delve into, but this should be pretty much all we need for our purposes, and it should be a pretty good guide for you. So I hope it's helpful. All right, guys.